The winter wind cut through the narrow streets of Boston like a blade, carrying with it the smell of salt from the harbor and the quiet fury of a people who no longer believed they were free. In the dim glow of oil lamps, footsteps echoed on frozen cobblestone as men pulled their coats tighter, not just against the cold, but against the weight of history pressing down on their backs. None of them knew it yet, but the choices made in moments like this, ordinary, fearful, defiant moments, would one day be called the birth of a nation. Long before the United States had a name, before it had a flag or a constitution, or even a shared idea of itself, it existed as a tension, a pressure, a question with no clear answer. 13 distant colonies clung to the eastern edge of a vast, unfamiliar continent, bound together not by unity, but by circumstance. They spoke the same language, prayed to the same God, and pledged loyalty to the same king, yet they lived lives shaped by forests, rivers, and frontiers that Europe could barely imagine. For more than a century, these colonies had grown quietly. Farmers carved homesteads out of wilderness. Merchants built fortunes trading fish, timber, and tobacco. Towns rose around churches, docks, and taverns, where news traveled faster than official letters ever could. The British Empire, confident in its power, allowed them a measure of independence, not out of kindness, but convenience. An ocean separated ruler from ruled, and as long as taxes were paid and loyalty sworn, London saw little reason to interfere. That distance, however, would become both the colonies' greatest protection and their greatest temptation. By the mid-1700s, the world was locked in a brutal struggle for power. Britain and France fought not just in Europe, but across oceans and continents, from India to the Caribbean to the dense forests of North America. What the colonists would later call the French and Indian War was, to the British Crown, an expensive necessity. When it finally ended in 1763, Britain emerged victorious, but deeply in debt. Someone had to pay. From London's perspective, the answer was obvious. The colonies had benefited from British protection, therefore they should help shoulder the cost. From the colonies' perspective, this logic felt dangerously incomplete. They had not chosen the war. They had no representatives in Parliament. They had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs. And now, suddenly, they were being told that their prosperity belonged not to them, but to a distant government they could neither see nor influence. The first sparks of resistance did not come from revolutionaries. They came from shopkeepers, printers, stock workers, people whose lives depended on fragile margins. When the Stamp Act was introduced, requiring official stamps on newspapers, contracts, and legal documents, outrage spread quickly. It was not just about money, it was about principle. A tax imposed without consent struck at something deeply held, something that had been quietly forming in the colonial mind, the belief that freedom was not granted by kings, but owned by individuals. In taverns and meeting halls, arguments grew heated. Pamphlets were printed and reprinted, passed from hand to hand. Words became weapons. Some urged patience and loyalty, warning that rebellion would bring ruin. Others spoke of natural rights, of liberty as a birthright, not a privilege. These were dangerous ideas, radical ideas, and once spoken aloud, they could not be taken back. Boston became the heart of this unrest. A busy port city, it pulsed with commerce and conversation. British soldiers were sent to maintain order, but their presence only deepened resentment. Red coats marching through narrow streets were a constant reminder of foreign authority. Tensions simmered, then boiled over. On a cold night in March 1770, a confrontation between colonists and British soldiers turned deadly. Shots rang out. 5 men lay dead in the snow. The event would later be named the Boston Massacre,
though the truth was messier, more human, more tragic. Fear, confusion, anger, all collided in seconds that would echo for generations. Among those watching events unfold was a lawyer named John Adams. He believed deeply in justice, even when justice demanded defending the unpopular. When British soldiers were put on trial, Adams took their case, arguing not for empire, but for the rule of law. His defense did not make him a loyalist in the eyes of history. It made him something more complicated, a man struggling to reconcile principle with passion in a time when extremes were becoming the norm. The acquittal of most soldiers calmed nothing. If anything, it sharpened the divide. To many colonists, it confirmed that British power would always protect its own. To others, it demonstrated that law could still prevail over mob anger. America, though it did not yet exist, was already arguing with itself. As years passed, new taxes and regulations followed. The Tea Act, intended to rescue a struggling British company, was the final insult for many. In December 1773, under the cover of darkness, men disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the icy water. The Tea Party was theatrical, symbolic, and deeply provocative. It was not an act of chaos, it was a calculated message. Britain responded with force. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, shut down Boston's port and stripped Massachusetts of self-governance. The message from London was equally clear: obedience would be restored, no matter the cost. But something unexpected happened. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, Britain united the colonies. Sympathy turned into solidarity. Food and supplies poured into Boston from other colonies. Committees of correspondence spread news and coordinated resistance. A sense of shared fate began to take shape. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They did not come as rebels declaring independence. They came as subjects seeking redress. Yet even in their cautious language, a shift was underway. They spoke not as isolated provinces, but as Americans. 1 year later, the fragile balance finally broke. At Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons. They did not expect resistance. What they found instead were armed farmers, militiamen who stood their ground. Shots rang out. No one could later say whose they were, and the world changed in an instant. The American Revolutionary War had begun. War has a way of forcing clarity where politics cannot. Men who once argued for compromise now picked up muskets. Others fled, choosing loyalty to the crown over uncertainty. Families split, communities fractured. There was no single American experience of the war, only countless personal stories of fear, sacrifice, and hope. George Washington, a Virginia planter with military experience and a commanding presence, was appointed commander of the Continental Army. He was not a perfect general. He lost battles, he made mistakes, but he possessed something rare, the ability to endure. Through freezing winters, unpaid troops, and near defeat, Washington held the army together by force of will and belief in a cause larger than himself. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in July 1776, transformed a rebellion into a revolution. Its words were bold, almost reckless. It did not ask for rights, it declared them self-evident. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, these were not British ideals, nor American ones alone. They were human ideals, and by claiming them, the colonies challenged the very foundation of monarchy. The war dragged on longer than anyone expected. Victory was never guaranteed. At times, it seemed impossible. Yet persistence, foreign alliances, particularly with France, and Britain's own exhaustion gradually shifted the balance. When the war finally ended in 1883, independence was secured, but the harder task lay ahead. Winning freedom was one thing, defining it was another. The new nation was fragile, divided by geography, economy, and ideology. The Articles of Confederation proved too weak, unable to bind the states into a functioning whole. Once again, Americans were forced to confront fundamental questions. How much power should government have? How could liberty be protected without descending into chaos? The Constitutional Convention of 1887 was an exercise in compromise and imagination. Delegates argued fiercely, sometimes bitterly. They disagreed.
What began as resistance to taxes had evolved into a radical idea that people could govern themselves, that authority derived not from bloodlines or crowns, but from consent. This idea would inspire movements far beyond America's shores, igniting hope and fear in equal measure. Yet even as the nation took its first steps, contradictions loomed. Freedom was proclaimed in a land where millions remained enslaved. Equality was celebrated in a society that excluded women and indigenous peoples from its promises. The story of America was not one of instant justice, but of an ongoing struggle between ideals and reality. That struggle, the tension between what America claimed to be and what it truly was, would shape every chapter that followed. And this is only the beginning. The first volunteers who marched off to war in the spring of 1861 believed with almost painful certainty that the conflict would be brief. Flags waved, bands played, and speeches promised glory. Men on both sides spoke of honor and duty, of defending homes or preserving a nation. Few imagined the scale of suffering that lay ahead. Fewer still understood that this war would not simply determine borders or governments, but redefine the meaning of freedom itself. The early months of the Civil War were marked by confusion and misplaced confidence. At the First Battle of Bull Run, civilians picnicked on nearby hills, expecting entertainment rather than carnage. What they witnessed instead was chaos. Lines broke, soldiers fled. The reality of modern warfare, rifled muskets, massed artillery, and the sheer brutality of industrial killing shattered illusions on both sides. The war would not be short, it would be total. Abraham Lincoln faced a nation tearing itself apart and an army unprepared for the task ahead. He was mocked, doubted, and underestimated. Yet beneath his awkward manner lay a growing moral clarity. At first, Lincoln framed the war narrowly as a fight to preserve the Union. Emancipation, he feared, would alienate border states and fracture fragile support. But as casualties mounted and the war dragged on, the connection between Union victory and the destruction of slavery became unavoidable. The battlefield was relentless. At Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American history, over 20,000 men were killed or wounded in a matter of hours. Fields turned red. Churches became hospitals. Surgeons worked without anesthesia, amputating limbs in piles that haunted survivors long after the war ended. Soldiers wrote letters home that mixed hope with despair, bravery with terror. Many never returned. In January 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, but it transformed the war's purpose. The Union was now fighting not only for survival, but for a new birth of freedom. Black men joined the Union Army in large numbers, fighting for a nation that had not yet fully accepted them. Their courage challenged long-held racist assumptions and reshaped the moral landscape of the war.
The Confederacy fought with desperation and resolve, defending not just territory, but an identity built on hierarchy and tradition. Leaders like Robert E. Lee became symbols of Southern honor, even as the cause they served was inseparable from slavery. The war consumed the South's resources, its cities, its sons. By the final years, starvation and exhaustion were as deadly as bullets. When Union General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, he brought the war home to civilians. His strategy of total war targeted infrastructure, farms, and railroads, aiming to break the Confederacy's will. It was effective and devastating. The romantic image of war collapsed under the weight of its consequences. In April 1865, as Union forces closed in, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union had survived. Slavery was dead in law, though not yet in practice. The nation stood at the edge of something entirely new. Then, in a moment that would scar the national psyche, Lincoln was assassinated. His death turned grief into uncertainty. The man best equipped to guide the nation through reconciliation was gone. What followed was Reconstruction, a period filled with promise and betrayal. Constitutional amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and promised equal protection under the law. For a brief time, the South saw Black Americans vote, hold office, and claim rights long denied. But progress was fragile. Resistance was fierce. White supremacist groups used terror to undermine Reconstruction governments. Political will in the North faded as fatigue set in. Compromises were made. Federal troops withdrew. The promise of equality gave way to segregation, disenfranchisement, and violence. The nation moved forward, but unevenly, carrying unresolved wounds. As the 19th century closed, America transformed again. Railroads stitched the continent together. Factories rose. Cities swelled with immigrants seeking opportunity. Wealth accumulated at unprecedented levels, while laborers toiled in dangerous conditions for meager wages. The gap between rich and poor widened, echoing earlier struggles under new names. Progress came with unrest. Strikes erupted. Reformers demanded change. Women organized for suffrage, arguing that democracy without their voices was incomplete. The ideals of the revolution were invoked once more, not as memory, but as demand. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had emerged as an industrial power, confident and restless. Yet beneath its success lay familiar tensions between freedom and order, opportunity and inequality, ideals and reality. The story of America remained unfinished, shaped by each generation's willingness to confront its contradictions. The Civil War had answered one question decisively. The Union was permanent, but it left another unanswered. Could liberty be made real for all? That question would define the struggles to come.
As the smoke of the Civil War drifted into memory, America entered an age of astonishing speed. Time itself seemed to compress. Railroads sliced through plains and mountains, carrying people, goods, and ideas at a pace that would have stunned the founders. Steel replaced wood, machines replaced muscle, and the nation began to measure progress not in acres settled, but in output produced. Cities rose upward as much as outward. New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh became symbols of possibility and excess. Immigrants arrived by the millions, speaking dozens of languages, carrying hopes as heavy as their suitcases. For many, America was not a nation, but a promise, unwritten, uncertain, but irresistible. For others, it was a place of exploitation, where 12-hour shifts and child labor were the price of survival. Industrial wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. Men like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Morgan reshaped the economy, celebrated by some as captains of industry and condemned by others as robber barons. Their fortunes built libraries, universities, and infrastructure, but also exposed the brutal imbalance of power in an unregulated system. Labor unions emerged not as theory, but necessity. Strikes were met with violence. The struggle between capital and labor echoed earlier conflicts over land and liberty. Reform movements gathered momentum. Journalists exposed corruption and unsafe conditions. Progressive politicians pushed for regulation, antitrust laws, and social protections. Women organized across class lines, demanding suffrage as both right and remedy. When the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920, it marked not an end, but an expansion of democratic possibility. America's gaze turned outward as well. The Spanish-American War announced the nation's arrival on the global stage. Overseas territories brought power and responsibility and controversy. Could a republic founded on self-rule justify empire? The question lingered, unresolved, as the 20th century unfolded. World War I pulled the United States into a conflict born far from its shores. American soldiers crossed the Atlantic carrying both weapons and ideals. The war reshaped global politics and left Europe shattered. At home, it accelerated social change. Women entered factories in new roles. African Americans migrated north in search of opportunity, reshaping cities and culture. Yet fear accompanied change. Dissent was suppressed. Immigrants were viewed with suspicion. Liberty bent under the pressure of war. The Roaring Twenties followed, a decade of jazz, speculation, and confidence. Prosperity seemed endless until it wasn't. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the illusion of stability collapsed. The Great Depression exposed the vulnerabilities of the system. Banks failed, unemployment soared, breadlines stretched through city streets. Faith in unfettered markets vanished alongside savings. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal redefined the relationship between government and citizen. Through relief programs, public works, and financial reforms, the federal government assumed responsibility for economic stability and social welfare. Critics warned of overreach. Supporters saw salvation. The debate over the role of government became a permanent feature of American life. World War II demanded unity on an unprecedented scale. The attack on Pearl Harbor erased isolationist illusions overnight. Factories converted to war production. Women became symbols of industrial strength. Soldiers crossed across Europe and the Pacific. The war revealed both America's capacity for leadership and its moral failures, including the internment of Japanese Americans driven by fear rather than evidence. Victory in 1945 left the United States in a position of unmatched power. The world looked to America not just for economic aid, but moral direction. The Cold War that followed was a struggle of systems, ideologies, and influence. Nuclear weapons cast a shadow over every decision, turning survival into a matter of balance and restraint. At home, prosperity returned for many, but not for all. Suburban expansion transformed landscapes and lifestyles. Television shaped culture. Beneath the surface, inequalities persisted. Segregation remained law in much of the country. The contradiction between democratic ideals and racial reality could no longer be ignored. The civil rights movement rose with courage and discipline. Ordinary people challenged extraordinary injustice. Through boycotts, marches, and legal battles, they forced the nation to confront itself. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. spoke not of revenge, but redemption, calling America to live up to its promises. Progress came at great cost. Violence resisted change. Lives were lost. The 1960s tested America's faith in authority and tradition. The Vietnam War divided the nation. Trust in government eroded. Protest became patriotic for some, treasonous for others. The generation that had inherited post-war confidence now questioned every assumption. Yet out of turmoil
came transformation. Legal segregation ended, voting rights expanded, cultural boundaries shifted. America did not become what it promised overnight, but it moved closer. By the late 19th century, America stood as a global superpower, influential and contested. Its culture spread worldwide, its economy shaped markets, its ideals inspired movements, even as its actions drew criticism. History had not delivered a final verdict. It never does. America's story remained what it had always been, a continuous argument about freedom, power, and responsibility. Each era answered some questions and raised others. Each generation inherited both progress and unfinished work. The nation that began as a fragile rebellion had become a complex democracy, still wrestling with the tension between who it is and who it claims to be. And that tension would define the road ahead.
By the time the 20th century drew to a close, the United States was no longer simply a country, it was a symbol. To some, it represented freedom, innovation, and opportunity. To others, it embodied hypocrisy, inequality, and unchecked power. Both views were rooted in truth. America had reached a point where its influence could not be separated from its identity, and its identity could not be separated from its contradictions. The Cold War ended not with a battlefield victory, but with the collapse of an idea. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the ideological rival that had shaped American policy for nearly half a century vanished. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that history itself had turned a corner. Democracy and capitalism appeared triumphant. The United States stood alone as the world's dominant power, confident in its system and uncertain about its responsibilities. Globalization accelerated at a pace unseen before. Technology connected markets and people across borders. American corporations expanded worldwide. The Internet transformed communication, commerce, and culture. Innovation flourished, but so did disruption. Jobs disappeared as quickly as new ones appeared. Wealth accumulated at the top while many struggled to adapt. Once again, progress created winners and losers, and the distance between them widened. At home, debates over identity intensified. Immigration reshaped communities. Cultural diversity expanded, enriching society while provoking backlash from those who felt left behind. Questions of race, gender, and equality moved from the margins to the center of national conversation. The unfinished business of civil rights evolved into new struggles over representation, policing, and justice. On a clear September morning in 2001, history took a violent turn. The attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon shattered the sense of invulnerability that had defined the post-Cold War moment. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost in hours that felt unreal and irreversible. Fear and unity arrived together. Flags appeared everywhere. The nation mourned, then mobilized. The war on terror reshaped American life in visible and invisible ways. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq extended far longer than promised, costing trillions of dollars and countless lives. Security expanded, surveillance increased. Debates over liberty and safety returned with urgency, echoing earlier wartime tensions. The country struggled to balance protection with principle. The financial crisis of 2008 exposed deep structural weaknesses. Banks failed, homes were lost, trust in institutions collapsed once more. Government intervention prevented total collapse, but resentment lingered. The idea that the system was rigged gained traction across ideological lines. Populism rose on both left and right, fueled by anger and disillusionment. Social media transformed public discourse. Information traveled instantly, unfiltered and unverified. Voices multiplied, but so did division. Community fragmented into digital tribes. Consensus became elusive. The shared narrative that once anchored national identity began to dissolve.
Yet amid fragmentation, activism surged. Movements for racial justice, gender equality, and climate action mobilized millions. Younger generations questioned assumptions their parents had accepted. History was re-examined, symbols debated, and narratives challenged. The nation argued with itself in real time across screens and streets. The COVID-19 pandemic tested America's resilience in ways few events had before. Lives were lost, economies halted, science, politics, and personal freedom collided. The crisis revealed both extraordinary compassion and deep mistrust. It underscored inequalities that had long existed and forced a reckoning with collective responsibility. Through every crisis, the same underlying question persisted. What does it mean to be American? The answer was never singular. It was not confined to a document, a flag, or a moment of triumph. It lived in struggle, debate, and imperfect progress. It lived in the tension between ideals and reality. America had never been finished, and perhaps it never would be. The story that began in colonial resistance had become a global narrative of ambition and accountability. The nation's greatest strength lay not in certainty, but in its capacity for self-examination. Its greatest danger lay in forgetting that capacity. History offered no guarantees, only choices. The American experiment endured not because it was flawless, but because each generation was forced to decide whether its principles were worth renewing. Freedom required effort. Equality demanded courage. Democracy depended on participation. And so the story continued, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. An invitation to remember that nations, like people, are defined not by their origins alone, but by how they respond to their hardest truths. The United States was born in rebellion, shaped by conflict, and sustained by the belief that a more perfect union was always possible. The work was never done. And it still isn't.
History does not end when the ink dries on a document or when a generation passes from the stage. It lingers in institutions, habits, fears, and hopes, shaping decisions long after the original reasons have faded. In the United States, the early decades of the 21st century revealed how deeply the past continued to live within the present. Political divisions hardened into identities. Disagreement, once a feature of democratic life, increasingly felt like a threat to it. Trust in institutions, government, media, even science eroded under the weight of scandal, misinformation, and unmet expectations. Many Americans felt unheard, unseen, convinced that the nation they were promised was slipping away. Others believed, with equal conviction, that the nation was finally being forced to confront truths it had long avoided. Elections became referendums not just on policy, but on reality itself. Competing narratives battled for dominance, each claiming legitimacy, each accusing the other of betrayal. The language of patriotism was claimed by opposing sides, reflecting a deeper struggle over what America was and who it was for. Yet beneath the noise, everyday life continued. Families worked, struggled, loved, and hoped. Teachers shaped minds in underfunded classrooms. Nurses and doctors carried the weight of exhausted systems. Soldiers served far from home. Immigrants built new lives while navigating suspicion and sacrifice. The nation's story unfolded not only in headlines, but in ordinary persistence. Technology accelerated change faster than culture could absorb it. Artificial intelligence, automation, and digital economies reshaped labor and identity. Old jobs vanished, new ones emerged. The definition of work, privacy, and even truth evolved. Each advance brought promise and anxiety, echoing the industrial transformations of earlier centuries. Climate change added another layer of urgency.
Fires, floods, and storms blurred the line between natural disaster and human consequence. Debates over responsibility and action reflected familiar patterns, short-term interests clashing with long-term survival. The question was no longer abstract, it was visible, measurable, and personal. America's role in the world also shifted. Rivals rose, alliances strained, the assumption of unquestioned leadership faded. The nation faced a choice between cooperation and isolation, between influence rooted in example or imposed by force. History offered warnings, but no easy answers. Throughout these challenges, the Constitution endured, not as a sacred relic, but as a living argument. Its interpretation remained contested, its promises incomplete. Courts ruled, legislatures stalled, citizens protested. The system bent, sometimes dangerously, but it did not break. Its resilience depended not on perfection, but participation. What became increasingly clear was that democracy was not self-sustaining. It required memory. It required humility. It required the willingness to accept loss and compromise without surrendering principle. These were not guarantees of victory, but conditions of survival. America had always been a paradox, powerful yet fragile, idealistic yet flawed. Its greatest achievements emerged not from unanimity, but from struggle. Its darkest moments came when fear silenced conscience or when power outran accountability. Looking back across centuries, a pattern emerged. Progress was never linear. Rights were claimed, denied, reclaimed. Expansion created opportunity and injustice in equal measure. Reform followed crisis, only to generate new tensions. Each generation faced the same fundamental choice: retreat into certainty or move forward through complexity. The American experiment was never about reaching an endpoint. It was about sustaining a process, one that demanded engagement, honesty, and restraint. The promise of the nation lay not in declaring itself exceptional, but in proving itself accountable. In classrooms and courtrooms, in protests and polling places, the argument continued. Who belonged? Who decided? What did freedom require in an interconnected world? These questions did not weaken the nation, they defined it. The story that began with defiance against empire had become a test of self-rule on a scale the founders could scarcely imagine. Success was not assured, failure was always possible, but so was renewal. America's history was not a straight line from darkness to light. It was a long, uneven journey, marked by courage and contradiction, sacrifice and selfishness. Its meaning was not fixed by its past, but shaped by how that past was understood and confronted. In the end, the United States was not merely a place or a power. It was an idea under constant negotiation between generations, between ideals and realities, between memory and hope. And as long as that negotiation continued, imperfect and unfinished, the story remained alive, not as a legend to be recited, but as a responsibility to be carried forward.
Every nation tells stories about itself. Some are comforting, some heroic, some deliberately incomplete. The United States has always told a story of beginnings, of rebellion against tyranny, of freedom wrested from power, of a people daring to govern themselves. But the deeper truth of America has never lived only in its beginnings. It has lived in what followed, in how each generation answered the same question in a different voice. What will you do with the freedom you inherited? The American story is not clean, it is not simple, it is not innocent. It is marked by conquest and courage, by cruelty and compassion, by vision and violence. It is a nation that declared all men created equal while permitting slavery,
that celebrated opportunity while denying it to many, that spoke of justice while struggling to deliver it. These contradictions were not accidents, they were the price of building a republic out of imperfect people. Yet what makes the United States historically unique is not that it fell short of its ideals, but that it wrote those ideals down in a way that allowed them to be used against power itself. Again and again, Americans returned to the nation's own words to demand change. Enslaved people, women, workers, immigrants, and civil rights activists all pointed to the same promises and asked why they did not yet apply to them. Progress came not because the system was generous, but because people were relentless. Power in America has always been contested. That contest has been loud, uncomfortable, and often painful, but it has also been the engine of reform. When the nation drifted too far from its principles, crisis forced reckoning. When fear dominated, courage eventually re-emerged. When unity fractured, the idea of union was tested and, more often than not, reforged. The future of the United States has never depended on perfection. It has depended on participation. Democracy survived not because it eliminated conflict, but because it created space for it without resorting to permanent force. The moment Americans stop arguing about justice, liberty, and responsibility is the moment the experiment truly fails. History offers no guarantee that the story will end well. Empires fall, republics collapse, democracies erode quietly before they shatter suddenly. The United States is not exempt from those patterns. Its strength lies not in believing it is immune, but in recognizing that survival requires effort, memory, and restraint. America remains unfinished because it was designed that way. A living constitution, a restless society, a permanent struggle between power and principle. Each generation inherits both the achievements and the failures of the last, and with them, the obligation to choose. That is the real legacy of the United States. Not a flawless past, not a guaranteed future, but an enduring responsibility. The story does not end here. It passes, quietly, urgently, into the hands of those who decide whether the ideals written centuries ago will remain words on paper or continue to be demands placed on the present. And in that choice, made again and again, the American story continues.